Good evening. I'm Ethan Nosowsky, editorial director of Grey Wolf Press, and I'm so honored to be here as part of the Lannan Foundation's Readings and Conversation series. I've worked in the publishing industry for 20 years now, and am intimately acquainted with how indispensable the Lannan Foundation has become to the literary community. The support they give both directly to writers and indirectly through publishers like Grey Wolf helps keep our literary ecosystem sustainable, so thank you. I'm an editor, and in truth, my job is actually pretty easy. You pick up a manuscript, and on the first page, you encounter a prose style and a voice so immediately arresting and original that you feel you can safely knock off to read for the rest of the afternoon because you know you'll be bugging your colleagues about it first thing the next day. As Gertrude Stein said, you know it's good when the bell rings. And that's what it was like when I read the opening pages of Kevin Barry's City of Bohane. The bell was clanging wildly. So I work for this snooty literary publisher where we look at the sentences first, the characters second, and the story dead last. And so as I kept reading the manuscript, I worried a little bit. The plot zips along like something out of a Hollywood blockbuster. Probably not right for Grey Wolf. But then, why not? We love a rollicking story too, and the language, it just sang. The sentences were full of fresh, just gooey, sticky words. It was as though you could feel them, and the most vivid images you could imagine popped up on every page. He has a blistering, supremely confident style that makes you wonder what they put in the water there in Ireland. And yes, on top of that, he never forgets to entertain. City of Bohane, which Kevin will read from a bit tonight, is a tale of two rival gangs that takes place perhaps 50 years in the future in Western Ireland, but not a Western Ireland or even a future that seems to have emerged from any sort of historical progression. There are no computers or telephones. The characters dress like Edwardian dandies and listen to music that seems unmistakably like Jamaican ska and rocksteady from the mid-1960s. No one can resist triangulating when they finish this book. Barry's editor in England said the novel read, quote, as if James Joyce had sat down and written Sin City. That feels right, but the dialect Barry creates for his characters also made me think of Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, and the plot made me think about Scorsese's Gangs of New York. And the noir vibe was a knowing kind of noir, delivered with a wry wink straight out of a Tom Waits song. One of my colleagues invoked The Wire. Whatever the book was, it was immediately clear to me that it marked the noisy arrival of undeniable talent. In fact, though, I'd already been reading some short stories by Kevin, published by an excellent small publisher in Ireland called Stinging Fly. Unlike Bohane, or at least not quite like Bohane, those stories were deeply rooted in this world and were being compared to the work of William Trevor and V.S. Pritchett. Let's be frank, though. Kevin often writes about unreconstructible degenerates. And he writes about them with unabashed love and admiration. Kidnappers, cynics, drug dealers, unrepentant alcoholics, self-harmers, and plenty of hopeless dreamers find a comfy home in his stories. As a reviewer of his collection, Dark Lies the Island put it in the New York Times Book Review, by the end of a story, Barry has me in full sympathy with someone I might edge away from on the train. And he went on to laud his, quote, his regard for characters big and small and capacity to be funny without playing them for cheap laughs. What's perhaps most notable, or at least most immediately notable, though, is that on every page of a Kevin Barry story, you'll find the most arresting original phrases that glint sharply with poetry and insight, summoning a character in a deftly deployed metaphor, or making a landscape seem utterly alive, a character in itself. You'll see, too, that yes, he can be funny, and for all the cruelty and violence, or maybe because of it, he's a deeply human and empathic writer. We've been lucky at Grey Wolf to publish Bohane as well as Kevin's two story collections to date, and it's been fun to read these reviews. Here are some of the words that get tossed around by critics to describe his work: scintillating, intense, thrilling, hilarious, virtuosic, brilliant, extraordinary, a master. Booklist said that, quote, Barry is already pushing a wheelbarrow of prizes stacked high with expectations, and that he will be a household name, and soon. So let me give you some facts about this shady character you're about to meet. Kevin Barry was born in Limerick in 1969 and now lives in County Sligo in Ireland. But along the way, he has lived in Cork, Dublin, London, Edinburgh, Liverpool, Ithaca, Atlanta, Santa Barbara, Montreal, Barcelona, and Malaga. And as he told me the other day, that's just under his present alias. During his peregrinations, and while staying put in the bunker he lives in, which he'll tell you about, he managed to write the 3 books I've described, and his work has now been translated into 16 languages. His stories have been published in The New Yorker, Granta, Tin House, and many other magazines and journals. In 2013, City of Bohane was named winner of the Impact Dublin International Literary Award, one of the biggest cash awards in the world for a single book. And his stories have been honored numerous times, including the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, the Sunday Times Short Story Award, and the Frank O'Connor Short Story Award. Now, if that doesn't seem sufficiently impressive, he's helped make 2 short films and has 4 screenplays in development, including for City of Bohane and for the collection Dark Lies the Island, both of which we'll be hearing him read from today. Wait, I forgot about the 3 radio plays, and the theater productions and the essays and the collaborations with visual artists. I'm sure I've forgotten something else as well, and so my apologies to you, Kevin. Actually, in fact, I wrote this a few days ago, and just last night, Kevin told me that he and his wife are starting a new literary magazine, so there's that. So add that to the pile. Anyway, all of this is part of Kevin's expressed plan for utter world domination. You know, the sad truth is, and don't tell anyone I said it, but writers often aren't the best readers of their own work. Well, you guys are in for a treat. Kevin is an excellent reader, and it's not just because of the funny accent. And it's my great pleasure to welcome the wicked, but really quite charming, Kevin Barry.
Right, so batten down the hatches. We're going to go for this. Thank you so much, Ethan, for that wonderful, very generous introduction. I always sound really busy in these introductions. I actually work for about an hour and a half a day. I don't know how I manage it. Thanks so much to everyone at the Lannan Foundation for having me here. It's a real treat to come and read for you in Santa Fe. I myself reside in the mountains in County Sligo in the northwest of Ireland, in a place called the Curlew Mountains. The Curlew Mountains at their highest peak rise to some 385 feet. Actually, on my way here, I was under the belief that this was possibly going to be the highest elevation ever achieved by an Irishman from County Sligo. To my horror, I discovered that Colm Tóibín was here last year, so I'm foiled again. But it's great to be here, and I'm going to read a few different things. I'm going to read from a short story, a kind of an abridged version of a story. I'll read a little bit from City of Bohane, from the novel, and I'll finish with a piece of non-fiction about where I live now in County Sligo. But we'll start with a story. And what I have to do always, as ever, at this point of the evening, is I have to look very, very carefully around the audience. And I have to look into all of your souls. And I have to try and gauge what level of filth I think you can handle at what's still quite a delicate hour of the evening. Okay, we're going to go for it. This is a story about, I'm going to read a kind of an abridged version of this story. I'll read the start, I'll skip the middle, and we'll go on and read the end. And it's amazing how little you'll miss. It's a story about an Irish poet who tires of city life in Dublin and decides to buy an old hotel out in the west of Ireland. And we're going to find out how he gets on out here in a place called the Fjord of Killery. And when the story appeared, it came out in the New Yorker magazine, and I met an actual Irish poet on the street in Galway City in Ireland, the late Dennis O'Driscoll. And he said to me, "Oh, I read that story of yours about the Irish poet in the New Yorker." I said, "Okay." And he said, "It was good, it was funny." I went, "Phew, okay." And I confessed to Dennis that I did have actually one qualm or reservation about the story. I said, "Dennis, I thought, would an Irish poet really have the wherewithal or the resources to buy a hotel?" And he said, "Don't underestimate us." So this is from the story. Actually, before I begin, I need to apologize in advance for the truly appalling language. Okay? But the thing about Irish people and swearing is that we do it so well. So this is from the story titled Fjord of Killery. So I bought an old hotel out on the Fjord of Killery. It was set hard by the harbour wall, with Moel Ray Mountain across the water and disgracefully grey skies above. It rained 297 days of the average year, and the locals were given to magnificent mood swings. The night in question, the rain was especially violent. It came down like handfuls of nails flung hard and fast by a seriously riled sky god. I was at this point 8 months in the place and about convinced it would be the death of me. It's end of the fucking world stuff out there, I said. The chorus of locals in the hotel's lounge bar, as always, ignored me. I was a fretful blow-in by their mark and simply not cut out for tough, gnarly West of Ireland living. They were listening instead to John Murphy, our alcoholic funeral director. "I'll bury anything that fucking moves," he said. "Bastards, suicides, tinkers," he said. "I couldn't give a monkey's curse." Moel Ray is the most depressing mountain you've ever seen, by the way. And its gaunt, looming shape filled almost every view from the Water's Edge Hotel, the lounge bars included. The locals drank mostly Bushmills whiskey and Guinness stout, and they drank them to great excess. I wiped their slops from the counter with a bar cloth I had come to hate with a passion that verged on the insane. I looked out the window. I said, "But seriously, folks, that's one motherfucker of a high tide, no?" Barely the toss of a glance did I receive. The bar talk had shifted to roads, mileage, and general directions. They made a geography of our country by the naming of pubs. "Do you know Madigan's Bar in Maynooth Town?" "I do, of course." "You take a left-hand turn there." "I have you now." My hotel had 23 bedrooms and it listed westward. Set a can of beans on the floor of just about any bedroom and it would roll slowly in the direction of the gibbering Atlantic. The estate agent had gussied up the history of the place in the brochure. Traditional coaching inn, original beams, visited by Thackeray, heritage bleeding out the wazoo. And I had leapt at it. I was the last of the hopeless romantics. The bar talk moved on briefly from roads and directions. "If he's still around when her bandages come off," Bill Knott, the surveyor, said, "he's a braver man than me." "She's a nice woman," John Murphy agreed, "as long as you don't put your hand in the cage." Behind the bar, the Guinness tap, the Smithwick's ale tap, the lager taps, the line of optics, the neatly stacked rows of glasses, and a high stool that sat by a wee slit window with a view across the water towards Moel Ray. The iodine tang of kelp hung in the air always and put me in mind, cheerfully, of embalming fluid. Bill Knott looked vaguely from his Bushmills whiskey out towards the water. "It's highish all right," he said, "but now what would we be talking about to get to Belmullet town, would you say, if we were moving on a slow road?" The primary interest of these people's lives, it seemed to me, was how far one place was from another, and how long it might take to complete the journey given the state of the roads. Bill had been in haulage as a young man, considered himself expert. "I don't know, Bill," I said. "Would we say about an hour and 20 if you weren't tail-backed out of Newport?" I said, "I really don't fucking well know, Bill." "There are those who'd say you'll do it in the hour," he sipped delicately. "But you'd want to be grease fucking lightning coming up out of Westport, wouldn't you?" We could be swimming it yet, Bill, I said. Now, I had made, despite it all, a mild success of myself in life. But on turning 40 the previous year, I sensed exhaustion rising up in me like rot. I found that to be alone with the work all day was increasingly difficult, and the city had become a jag on my nerves. The brochure about the hotel appeared in my life like a revelation. I clutched it in my hands for days on end. I grew feverish with this notion of a westward flight. I lay in bed with the brochure as the throb of the city sounded outside, and I moaned as I read aloud, "Original beams. Traditional coaching in Thackeray, established 1648. Yes, the hotel had the promise of an ideal solution. I could distract myself with its day-to-day running, its endless little errands, and perhaps late at night or very early in the morning, I would continue at some less intense level with the poetry. All my friends, every last one of them, said, "The Shining." But I was thinking, the west of Ireland, the murmurous ocean, the rocky hills hard-founded in a greenish light, the cleansing air, the little stoats peeping shyly from gaps in the dry stone walls. It would all do to make a new man of me. Of course, I hadn't counted on having to listen to my summer staff, a pack of energetic young Belarusians fucking each other at all hours of the clock. And the ocean turned out to gibber rather than murmur. Gibber, gibber, whoosh. Gibber, gibber, whoosh. Down at the far end of the bar, Mick Harty, distributor of bull semen for our vicinity, was molesting his enormously fat wife, Vivian. "We're after a meal at the place run by the Dutch crowd," he said. "We had oysters for a starter. They have me gone fucking bananas." Vivian slapped and roared at him as he stroked her massive haunches. She reddened and chortled as he twisted her around and pulled her vast rear side towards his crotch area. Nobody apart from myself paid a blind bit of attention to the spectacle. And even as she suffered this assault from her cackling husband, she turned to me and informed me precisely what they had paid for the meal at the Dutch couple's restaurant. "We had 2 starters, 2 mains, we shared the dessert, 2 bottles of wine, 2 cappuccinos," she said, as Mick grinded slowly behind, hoarsely yodeling an Alicia Keys love ballad. €136 even, not cheap, Queeveen. "Cappuccino's a breakfast drink," I said. "You're not supposed to drink it after a meal." I was not well liked out in Killery. I was considered superior. Of course, I was fucking superior. I ate at least 5 portions of fruit and veg daily. I had omega-3 from oily fish coming out my ears. I limited myself strictly to 21 units of alcohol a week. I hadn't written 2 consecutive lines of a poem in 8 months flat. I was becoming versed instead in the strange illicit practices of the hill country. Just then, outside, a cacophony erupted. From the hillsides everywhere came the aggravated howling of dogs. These were amped to an unnatural degree. The talk in the lounge bar stalled for a moment in response, but abruptly it resumed. "The tiramisu," McCarthy said. "You wouldn't know whether to eat it or smear it all over yourself." Nadia, one of my Belarusians, came through from the supper room and sullenly collected some glasses. "The arse on that," John Murphy said. "Please, John," I said. "Like 2 apples in a hanky," he said. I believed that all 9 of my summer staff were in sexual contact with one another. I housed them in the dreary, viewless rooms at the back of the hotel, where I myself lived during what I would laughably describe as high season, and my sleepless nights were filled with the sound of their rotating passions. "Thank you, Nadia," I said. She scowled at me as she placed the glasses in the dishwasher. I was not allowed to forget I was paying minimum wage. The dogs had stopped. The rain continued. It was by now an hysterical downpour, with great sheets of water streaming down from Whale Ray, and the harbour roared in the fattening light. Visibility was reduced to 14 feet in front of our faces. This all signalled that the West of Ireland holiday season had begun. "He was thrown down," John Murphy said, speaking of a man he had lately buried. "Ara, he went into himself. He didn't talk for about a year and a half, and then he choked on a burnt sausage. You'd visit and he wouldn't say anything to you, but he'd know you were there all right. The little eyes would follow you around the room." "What age was he when he went, John?" 42. "That's youngish." Ara, he was better off out of it. My first weeks at the Water's Edge Hotel, I had kept a surreptitious notebook under the bar. The likes of "thrown down" would get a delighted entry. I would guess at the likely etymology, from thrown down, maybe, as in laid low, but quickly I had had my fill of these maudlin bastards. This, by the way, was the Monday of the May bank holiday weekend. Killery was in fete. Local opinion, cheerfully, was that it had been among the wettest bank holidays ever witnessed. The few deluded hill walkers and cyclists who had shown up departed early in wordless outrage, and in the library room of the Water's Edge there was just a pair of elderly couples still enjoying the open fire. I left the bar and took a pass through the library to smile at them, throw on a few sods of turf, and make sure they hadn't died off on the premises. They stared into the flames. "That's some evening," I tried. No response. Both couples held hands and appeared to be significantly tranquilized. Coming back through the lobby again, I looked out the doors and I saw a pair of minks creep over the harbour wall. They crossed the road in perfect tandem and headed for the rising fields beyond the hotel. I went back into the bar. I had an odd nausea developing. "They can cut out that particular gland," Bill Knott was saying. "But if the wound goes septic after," he shook his head hopelessly, "that," he said, "is when the fun and games start." Now I'm going to skip on a few pages. And we're going to go towards the end of the story. All you need to know: the rain keeps coming down. The waters keep rising. The locals keep drinking. That's all you're missing. So towards the end of the Fjord of Killery, the worst of the news was that the emergency appeared to be localized. The Fjord of Killery was flooding when no other place was flooding. The rest of the country was going about its humdrum Monday night business, watching football matches or Dan Brown adaptations, putting out the bins or putting up with their marriages, while the people of our vicinity prepared for watery graves. I felt the worst possible course would be to close the bar. There was a kind of hilarity to the proceedings still, and this would not be maintained if I stopped serving booze. The pace of the drinking, if anything, quickened now that the waters were rising. You never know when you might lift your last. Would we want to be making south? Mick Harty wondered. Vivian, his wife, rubbed at his wrist so tenderly I found myself welling up. "Hush now," she said. "Hush it, babes." "If we went around past Loch Fee," said Bill Knott, "and swung around the far side of her, we could nearly make it fairly quick to the N59. The Belarusians, meanwhile, carted box-loads of old curtains from the attic to use as sops against the doorways, but the moment the last box-load reached the bottom of the stairs, the doors popped and the waters of Killery entered my old hotel. I moved everybody upstairs. There was a function room up there that I used for the occasional wedding. It had a fully stocked bar and operational disco lights. We weren't a moment too soon. As I trailed up the stairs, keeping to the rear of all my locals and Belarusians, I cast an eye back over my shoulder. It had the look of death's dateless night back there. "Hop, people," I cried. "Come on now, hop, move." More calls were made on cell phones. We were promised that the emergency services were being moved out. I turned off the harsh strip lighting overhead in the function room and switched to the mood lighting, which moved in lovely, dreamy disco swirls. Even yet, the rain hammered down on my old hotel at Killery Harbour. I opened the bar and the locals were not shy about stepping up to it. We drank. We whispered. We laughed like cats. Bill Knott reckoned the distance to Clare Island overseas, if it should come to it. And of course it would not be the first time, he said, that the likes of us would be sent hopping for the little boats. Vivian Harty whispered to Janie McAllister. Janie's colour was returning with frequent nips of my brandy. Vivian swirled it in the glass and fed it to the old lady, her tiny grey head she cradled on a vast lap. Thackeray, when he visited the backwoods of Ireland, bemoaned the choking peat smoke and the obstreperous cider and the diet of raw ducks and raw peas, and also a particular inn. No pen can describe that establishment, he wrote, as no English imagination could have conceived it. John Murphy told us very loudly that he loved his wife. She still excites me, he said. It's been 28 years, and I still get a horn on me when I see that bitch climb a stairs. I went to the landing outside the function room. I looked down the road. It was a waterway. The hotel porch had disappeared, and dozens of cormorants were approaching in formation across the water. It was like the attack on Dresden. I rushed back to the function room just as the cormorants landed on the kitchen roof out back, and a weeping Mick Harty was confessing to Vivian an affair of 15 years standing with her sister. All the old filth starts to come out, said John Murphy. Vivian approached her husband, and she embraced him, and she planted a light kiss on his neck as they held each other against the darkness. Then she bit him on the neck. Blood came in great angry spurts. I vomited briefly, and I decided to put on some music. I looked out the hallway window upstairs, as I dashed along the corridor to get some CDs from my room. This was a very bad move. 7 sheep in a rowing boat were being bobbed about on the vicious waters of Killery. The sheep appeared strangely calm. I picked lots of old familiars, ABBA, The Pretenders, Bryan Adams. I pelted back to the function room. We're here, I cried. We might as well have a disco. Oh, and we danced the night away out in the Fjord of Killery. We danced to Chiquitita, slowly and sensuously. We danced in great, wet-eyed nostalgia to Brass and Pocket, and we had all the old moves still, as if 1979 was only yesterday. We punched the air madly to Summer of '69. I went out to the hallway to find the 6 Belarusians sitting on the top step of the stairs. The waters of Killery were halfway up the stairs. Footstools sailed by in the lobby below, toilet rolls, placemats, phone books, but what could I do? I returned to the function room and I served out pints hand over fist. All the cell phone signals were down. There appeared on the horizon no saviors in high-vis clothing. The waters were rising yet, and the view was suddenly clear to me. The world opened out to its grim beyonds, and I realized that at 40, one must learn the rigors of acceptance. Capitalize it, acceptance. I needed to accept what was put before me, be it a watery grave in Ireland's only natural fjord, or a return to the city and its greyer intensities, or a wordless exile in some steaming Cambodian swamp hole, or poems or no poems, or children or not, lovers or not, illness or otherwise, success or its absence. I would accept all that was put in my way from here on through until I breathed my last. Electrified, I searched for a notebook. Bill Knott danced. John Murphy danced. The McAllisters and the Fettles waltzed. The Belarusians dry-humped one another in the function room's darker corners. The Hartys were in deep, emotional conversation in a booth. Mick held to his bleeding neck a wad of napkins. I myself took to the dance floor, swiveling slowly on my feet, and I closed my eyes against the swirling lights. "You enjoying yourselves, folks?" I cried. I went out to the landing for a spot check on the flood. I was met there by Alexei, the wall-eyed Belarusian. He indicated with a happy jerk of his thumb, the water level on the stairs. It had dropped a couple of steps. I patted his back, winked just once, and returned to the disco. 1648 was just a year shy of Cromwell's landing in Ireland, and already the inn at Killery Fjord was in business. It would see out this disaster too. Now random phrases and images came at me, the sudden, quick-fire assaults that signal a new idea, and I knew that they would come in sequence soon enough. Their predestined rhythms would assert. I felt a new, quiet ecstasy take hold. The gloom of youth had at last lifted. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to stay for just a little while now out on the west coast of Ireland. It's sometime in the 2050s. Actually, the thing about Ireland and writers and our great tradition of literature, like Ireland is a small, wet rock at the edge of the Atlantic. And if you throw a stick, you hit a writer over the head. The place is just crawling with them, you know? And they've done the country pretty well, you know. You look over at this part, and Anne Enright or Colm Tóibín has done that really well, or Edna O'Brien has done that part really well. John McGahern has done this part beautifully up there. So before I started the novel City of Bohane, I got a marker, and I got a map of Ireland, and I drew a new peninsula onto the west coast, and I said, "This is mine." And I set a demented little city out at the edge of it. One thing I should say about the language in the novel City of Bohane, and it's a big language performance, is that though it's an invented city and in an invented world, it comes very much from the way working class people in the cities I grew up in Limerick and in Cork, it comes from the way they use and beautifully abuse the English language and bring it to very strange and wonderful places. I'm just going to read a little from each of the first two chapters. It became, as I was writing, very quickly very evident to me that this was a kind of a Western. It's a future West of Ireland Western. And we're going to meet the cowboy in black and the cowboy in white very quickly. So a little from each of the first two chapters, just a couple of pages, just to give you a flavour of the novel. I am going to read this in the authentic accent of the city of Bohane, which turns out to be a little like my own accent. I don't know why that is. Chapter 1 is titled, The Nature of the Disturbance. Whatever's wrong with us is coming in off that river. No argument. The taint of badness on the city's air, it's a taint off that river. This is the Bohane River we're talking about. A blackwater surge, malevolent. It roars in off the big nothing waste, and the city was spawned by it and was named for it. City of Bohane. He walked the docks and breathed in the sweet badness of the river. It was past midnight on the Bohane front. There was an evenness to his footfall, a slow, calm rhythm of leather on stone, and the dockside lamps burned in the night-time, a green haze, the light of a sad dream. The water's roar for Hartnett was as the rushing of his own blood, and as he passed the merchant yards, the guard dogs strung out a sequence of howls all along the front. See the dogs, their hackles heaped, their yellow eyes livid. We could tell he was coming by the howling of the dogs. The police watched him, the police. They watched him from a distance. They were fresh from the sight of a reefing. "You lamping him over," said one. "The albino motherfucker." "Set your clock by him," said the other. Albino, some called him. Others knew him as the long fella. He ran the Hartnett Fancy gang, and he cut off from the dockside and walked on into the back trace, the infamous Bohane trace, a most evil labyrinth, an unknowable web of streets. He had that back trace look to him. Dapper buck in a natty boy Crombie. The Crombie draped all casual-like over the shoulders of a pale, grey Italian suit, mohair. Mouth of teeth on him like a vandalised graveyard. But we all have our crosses. There was a pair of hand-stitched Portuguese boots that slapped his footfall, and the stress that fell, the emphasis was money. Hard got the riches. Oh, the stories that we told out in Bohane about Logan Hartnett. Dank little squares of the trace opened out suddenly, like gasps, as Logan passed through. Now, all sorts of queerhawks lingered in the Bohane trace in the small hours. They looked down as he passed by. They examined their toes and their sacks of tawny wine. You wouldn't make eye contact with the long fella if you could help it. Yes, strange, but we had a fear of him and a pride in him, both. He had a fine hold of himself, as we say out in Bohane. He was graceful and erect, and he looked neither left nor right, but straight out ahead always, with the shoulders thrown back, like a general, and walked the Arab tangle of alleyways and wines that make up the Bohane trace. And there was the slap, the lift, the slap, the lift of Portuguese leather on the back street stones. Yes, and Logan was in his element as he made progress through the labyrinth. He feared not the shadows. He knew the fibres of the place. He knew every last twist and lilt of it. Jenny Ching waited beneath the may tree in the 98er square. He approached the girl. His step was enough. She didn't need to look up to make the wreck. He smiled for her all the same, and it was a wry and long-suffering smile, as though to say, "Is this more of it, Jenny?" And he sat on the bench beside. He laid a hand on hers that was tiny, delicate, murderous. The bench had dead seasons of lovers' names scratched into it. "Well, girlie," he said. "The fucker what been reefed and smoked down," she said. "He was one of the Cusacks off the north side rises." "Did he have it coming, Jenny?" "Don't they always," she said, "the Cusacks." Logan shaped his lips thinly in agreement. "The Cusacks have always been crooked, girl," he said. Jenny was 17 that year, but wise beyond it. Careful she was, and a saucy little ticket in her low riders and wedge heels, her streaked hair pineappled in a high bun. "Do you want more Cusacks hurted so?" she said. He looked at her but briefly as he rose. The look was his word. "Are you sure about that, Mr. Hartnett?" she said. "Another winter of blood in Bohane, like." A smile, as grey as he could will it. "Oh, it'll make the long old nights fly past," he said. Logan Hartnett was minded to keep the Ching girl close. In a small city so homicidal, you need to watch out on all sides. He moved on through the gloom of the back trace. The streets of old tenements are tight, steep-sided, ill-lit, and the high bluffs of the city give the trace a closed-in feel. Our city is built along a run of these bluffs that bank and canyon the Bohane River. The streets tumble down to the river. It is a black and swift-moving rush at the base of almost every street, as black as the bog waters that feed it. And a couple of miles downstream, the river rounds the last of the bluffs, and there enters the murmurous ocean. The ocean is not directly seen from the city, but at all times there is the ozone rumor of its proximity, a rasp on the air, like a hoarseness. It is all of it as fucking bleak as only the west of Ireland can be. Now, very quickly in chapter 2, in classic traditional Western fashion, Logan's nemesis comes back to town after 25 years away. This is a gentleman called the Gant, Broderick, and he's going for a secret rendezvous in the city as he plots the taking over of the town's business. We're just going to briefly meet the Gant. Chapter 2 is titled, in classic Western fashion, The Gant's Return. That hot, defiant screech was the Bohane L train as it took the last turn onto De Valera Street. The L ran the snake bend of the street, its boxcar windows a blurring yellow on the downtown charge. The main drag was deserted this windless AM, and it was quiet also in the car that the Gant was sat in. There was just a pair of weeping whores across the aisle, Northside girls by the feline cut at their cheekbones, and a drunk in greasy overalls down the way. The L train was customarily so sad in this last stretch before dawn. That much had not changed. The screech of it was like a soul's screech. If you were lying there, out in Bohane, in the bed, lonesome, and succumbed to poetical thoughts, that screech would go through you. It happens that we are often just so, in Bohane, no better men for the poetical thoughts. The Gant took a slick of sweat from his brow with the back of a big hand. He had a pair of hands in him the size of Belfast sinks. The sweat was after coming out in him sudden. It was hot on the L train, and the tang of stolen youth seeped up in his throat with the rasping burn of nausea, and on the L train in yellow light, the Gant trembled. But the familiar streets rushed past as the L train charged, and pain of memory without warning gave way to a kind of joy. He was back, and the Gant beamed then, ecstatically, as he sucked at the clammy air, and he listened to the voices of the whores. "I fucking love that blatherin' cunt big time," said one. "The fucker was filth girls to bone through of it," said the other. "He was casting off all over the town. You check me? He took you for a gommy lackeen." The Gant left the train, and he looked out to the first of the Bohane morning. He set off for the Smoketown footbridge. He had a wee girl to meet in this place. It was a good time for such a meeting. Smoketown, he knew, would be black with people at this hour of the morning. The late shifts from the slaughterhouses and the breweries were only now clocking off. Industry. Bohane bills sausages and Bohane bills beer. We exist, after all, in the high 50s of latitude. The winters are fierce, and we need the inner fire that comes from voluminous drinking. The plants worked all angles of the clock, and after the night shift there was the custom to make for Smoketown and a brief revel. In the dawn haze, the brewery lads were dreamy-eyed from hops fume, while the slaughterhouse boys had been all the silver and shade of night up to their oxters and the corpses of beasts, filling the wagons for the butcher's slabs at the arcade market in the Bohane trace. And the wagons rolled out now across the greasy cobbles, and it was a gory cargo they hauled. See the peeled heads of sheep, and the veined fleshy haunches of pigs, and the glistening trays of livers and spleens, skirts and kidneys, lungs and tongues, carnivorous to a fault. We'd eat the whole lot for you out in Bohane. The Gant stepped over a gutter that ran torrentially with fresh blood. Our stockyards are laid out along the wharfs. Now how, he wondered, was a man expected to think civilized thoughts in a city the likes of Bohane? Thank you. Okay, from a made-up place, we're going to go to a real place. And this very short essay that I'm going to finish off with, it came about when the Observer newspaper in London asked me to write an essay on the very simple theme of where I live. So this is a piece called The Barracks. The house smelt of old sergeants. It was 30 years since it had been used as a police station, but there were still bars on the windows of the rooms out back. The echo of our footsteps across the stone floors broke the long silence that filled the house. As we pushed through the creaking doors, each room was a pocket of trapped time, as if the silence was just a pause in some hard conversation with a ghost of the local felonry. There was rising damp, peeling paint, and homicidal electrics. "It does need a little work," the estate agent said. My girlfriend and I exchanged a worried look. We knew at once that this old mess was home. There is a German word, Weltschmerz, that describes a feeling of homesickness for a place you've never been. And I knew that the Barracks, as it was still known, might ease such a feeling in me. There was a leaking chimney, There were crows coming through the chimney into the bedroom. There was a half-acre of Japanese knotweed and a general air of drizzle. We had an offer on the table inside 5 minutes. An offer, the estate agent said, and all the colour left her face. It had been built in the 1840s for the Royal Irish Constabulary in South County Sligo, between the Brickleave Mountains and the Curlews. It had a vantage view over a smoke-grey lake and was surrounded by reed fields that murmured in the breeze, and their summer gold was fading. And I worried at once that this was a place to inspire overly limpid prose. But it was time that I put down a root. I was 36 years old. This would be the first house I could call my own. Over the previous decade and a half, I had lived at 17 addresses across 9 cities of Ireland, Britain, the United States, and Spain. The psyche fractures from so much itinerant wandering. You're never sure where you are when you wake up in the morning. You turn a street in the city you're living in, and you expect a different city, a different street. You find that you're living in the amalgam place of a dream. Also, there was the situation with the books. There were, by this time, more than 70 large boxes of books. Recent moves had required the hiring of trucks for the books alone. We needed a place to keep the books. So we moved in. We painted the walls. We sanded the floorboards. We kept the bars on the windows in memoriam of those old sergeants. We got all the old chimneys patched up and all the crows out, and we cleared it and we lit fires. I'm a child of suburbia, and I was at first utterly freaked out by the sheer quiet at night and by the utter darkness that descended on the lake and the hills. The willows caught eerily in the wind. There were mystery rustlings from the hedgerows. But there was a kind of calm about the barracks itself. An odd comfort seemed to seep from its old bricks. I took the upstairs landing from my workspace, and very deliberately I faced the desk away from the view. But every few minutes I would creep up to the window. Just water and cattle and wooded hills rising into mist. But a storied past can project a rush of images to a suggestible mind. The barracks was built at a strategic point in the County Sligo hills, protective of the domain estates and hunting lodges around the lake. It was torched by the Irish Republican Army in the Civil War of the early 1920s and subsequently rebuilt to house the newly formed police force, the Garda Síochána. The guards had it till the 1970s. I understand from locals they used to go no further than the front gate to stage roadblocks and check vehicles for tax and insurance. They would have mugs of strong tea to hand against the inclements. The weather in South County Sligo is mostly overcast, but the lake makes the most of what light there is and refracts it, and the light, even on the greyest days, has a peculiar intensity, a luminescence. Quickly, as we settled in, I began to feel an unaccustomed creep of contentment. Happiness, for me, has tended to be retrospective. I'm never happy at the time. I'm generally moaning and grizzling at the time, but as soon as I leave a place, I become immediately nostalgic for it. I start to think about the good old days. And the barracks, as I finally cooled my heels, I grew almost pathologically wistful for the cities and the flats and the houses I had lived in. If they were full of grey ennui at the time, their colours came true in memory. Even a bleak time in East London can become, with perspective, a kind of idyll. And I can smile now on recalling the close shave I had with a double-decker bus when I left a Jamaican shebeen in a tower block at 7 in the morning and, frankly in something of a reduced condition, I attempted to cross Leytonstone High Road on all fours. You would imagine it difficult to be nostalgic for the likes of Leytonstone, but there you go. And I can remember now with great fondness the evil, long-stay motel I beached up in on State Street in Santa Barbara, a premises that was apparently occupied exclusively by eerily suntanned alcoholics. A Mexican dwarf lady used to sell crack and crystal meth from a pickup truck in the parking lot, and she would throw me a jaunty little wink each day as I passed by, and I would return the wink in kind. Strange the lovely poignancy the years have given to that odd flirtation. Random sounds and feelings come forth from the backways of time. I can hear again the afternoon clicking of the dominoes in Liverpool as the old Chinese dudes gambled and smoked heroically in the Chinatown social clubs. I can feel again the malevolent wind that lifts from the Port of Elite to assault the Edinburgh Newtown and leaves you with a face on like a skinned haggis. I remember the strange modernist mansion in the woods outside Ithaca in upstate New York, where we were allowed to rent the basement after the elderly owner had died, but she seemingly lingered. In the small hours of the night, there would be a shuffling upstairs and all the lights would come on, though nobody lived there anymore. We had a groundhog in the garden. I'd go outside for a cigarette in the morning, pale-faced after a night of ghosts, and the groundhog and I used to sit and eyeball each other. I've since quit smoking, but whenever I imagine now those luxurious tobacco tars and resins, I see a groundhog. These memories are stirred up each day as I cycle the Sligo countryside. After a sullen morning at the desk, and then the Harold Lloyd slapstick of my attempts at DIY, I get on my bicycle and pedal through the drizzle and the quiet. The effort required for the steep gradients of the hills releases endorphins, and these cause a giddiness. As I ratchet up through the gears, I make up nonsense country songs and sing them aloud. There are farmers in the vicinity who may believe me not to be quite there. I remember being peeled from the walls of questionable nightclubs in the city of Cork. I remember slow months in a room the size of a cupboard in Barcelona. I could make tea and toast without getting out of bed. I remember being a kid in Limerick, a serial truant, lying low around the back lanes and side streets of the city, and the chill of excitement when you learn the hidden town. But if I cycle a little faster, the past gives way to the moment, and the moment has its own romances. It would take a heart of stone not to imagine a music for the place names I pass by. Temple House Lake, the plain of Moytura, Ballandoon Abbey, the caves of Kesh. The names have melody and are themselves a song. Now, I make frequent jailbreaks from the barracks still. Bleak February groans to life and I'm history. I bolt for Andalusia in Spain. But when I'm away now, I can't help but think about the chair by the stove in the barracks, the squishy red armchair in which I plan to grow old, placid, and handsomely fat. The barracks has given me a place to allow my memories filter through and to make stories of them. Forgive a neat metaphor, but a writer's work is to police memory, and the precinct is the past. A life, however, must be written in the present tense. And when night falls, I can walk out into the darkness now, where the reed fields give onto the lake, and there's nothing to be heard but the breeze in the reeds. I tune in to the reed frequencies, and a nervous moorhen witters a threat that I should keep my distance. I squat on the old jetty, I close my eyes, and I listen to the ageless presence of the dark hills beyond. A feeling descends on me for a moment, and then more, and it's something like peace. Thank you very much. It's been lovely to read for.